Welcome to the Beantown Podcast, the People's Podcast. Today we are talking politics. We're going to be joined by a special correspondent in a little bit here. I was going back and forth this week thinking how I wanted to do it because you know me, I don't like to talk politics because of all the Obama tapping and stuff that's been going on. But we are going to take this in a completely different direction, a completely right direction, if you will, pun intended, and we are going to go a la right-wing conservative, Fox News, Bill O'Reilly, Tomi Lahren, Ben Shapiro. We're just going to really go for it. So without further ado, this is Beantown Podcast Talks Politics. Feel free to reach out to us. On Twitter, we are at BeantownCast. Our email is beantowncast@yahoo.com. That's Beantown, BeanTown podcast@yahoo.com. And finally, listener discretion is advised when you are listening to the Beantown Podcast. Number one, because we will occasionally use some liberal-type language here and there. And then number two, the podcast is just subjectively terrible. And although I'm going for my podcasting Emmy with this episode, I set low standards for myself. So we are going to get right into it with our lead story. Crazy leftists calling for violence against the right. Earlier this week, left-wing nutjob Maxine Waters urged supporters to surround members of the Trump cabinet at restaurants, gas stations, department stores. We're talking like Chick-fil-A's people, Home Depot's, Kmart's. Where does it stop with Maxine Waters urging them to incite widespread violence and bloodshed against members of the Trump administration? Then I don't know, you guys, I'm not a fan of failing Comedy Central. Trevor Noah, I don't think is very funny. Don't listen to him, but Comedy Central writer Curtis Cook this week tweets, "I wish this Kennedy had been shot instead of the other one." So let's jump right into this. Now, this isn't anything new. Left-wing Democrats, supposedly the party of tolerance and of acceptance, have been in a gigantic uproar for a year and a half now, ever since Trump took office and the failing Obama administration left the White House in shame, scandal, and humiliation. Now, the announcement that Justice Kennedy will retire, a man who is 81 years old, I might add. He doesn't get to retire because he's 81 years old. This announcement has sent the extremist alt-left media full of libtards and snowflakes into an absolute frenzy. From mass shootings to false claims of collusion, the alt-left has been crying for days upon end, and now it seems like they've completely lost their cool. On Good Morning America this week, Terry Moran bitched that Kennedy's retirement guarantees that this court and this country is going to change profoundly. Others have referred to the news as an absolute earthquake, whining about the democratic process of nominating a new Supreme Court justice. Even CNN has gone so failing fake news. CNN, I will add, has gone so far, and I don't really watch them, but I heard people say this to say that the Constitution of our own country is under attack. Seriously, liberals? Seriously? So when did we decide that conservatives aren't allowed to have democratic principles? Ever since 2008, when America and the Dems launched a full-out onslaught of our republic, we've continued to see a double standard. Invite whichever speakers you want to your campus to engage in discourse and discussion with your students, as long as they're left-wing or black or gay. Value all life and advocate and crusade for human rights, but not if they're unborn children. What's up with that? Investigate our country's general election over the meddling of foreign powers, wasting valuable time, energy, and resources on a judicial witch hunt in order to smear our president, but ignore the own tainted elections in the DNC that allowed crooked Hillary to win the Democratic nomination. And whose fault is it? Of course, it's President Trump. And of course, it's Republicans. Ever since losing so badly in 2016, Dems can't seem to stop whining, complaining, and flat out bitching, excuse my language, about how hard their lives are. So what's the easy thing to do? Blame the politicians who worked long and hard in order to get elected by you, the people. Not only do crazy left-wingers want to take our human rights away, but another After another mass shooting by a crazy MS-13 member, they want to take all of your firearms away from upstanding, hardworking Americans. And why? Because we're white. Because we won. Because we are winners. Look at 2016. Because we have this so-called white privilege, apparently. I don't know. Because suddenly, it's a crime to love the country you're from. When did Uncle Sam and God become enemy of Dems? Once they started losing. Okay, let's bring in Beantown Podcast political correspondent Nick Albano, now live from Capitol Hill or close to Capitol Hill. Nick, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
That was quite a speech. Before, I'd just like to say hello to all the followers of Beantown, specifically one follower, Quinn's mom. Thank you for listening, and I'm here to convert all of y'all to socialists. So let's get to it.
Oh boy, things could get fiery. Nick, let's put it bluntly. Why do the Democrats hate America?
The current state of our government is as such that it is acceptable to create concentration camps on the border and put children in it. And so if you are a leftist and are seeing this take place in your country, I don't think it's wrong for the average American to not be proud to be an American at this point. When you wake up and understand that your government is not only rounding up children, putting them into camps and separate from families, it's kind of hard to be proud. It's kind of hard to want to be a part of a country that thinks that's acceptable. So I think current left is that's a pretty good way to summarize it up, honestly.
We've seen the guilt trip before. We've seen the tears. We're going to talk about how all the Dems want a completely immigration-free, open borders policy, and a little bit later here on the show. We see failing CNN, New York Times, all those fake news media outlets complaining about this stuff. So you're saying that any gang members and criminals, whomever, should just be able to waltz into Texas and take over like Sicario, Day of the Soldado, out in the theaters now. Nick, what do you say to that? Well, we're trying to get advertising dollars. Thank you.
Money for this overwhelming amount of immigrants coming to this country are not as the fascists like for us to stage over and over again. MS-13 individuals, they're just people coming from war-torn countries, countries that are warming up with global warming, seeing fail, and they're coming to this country for a better opportunity. And what we're doing on the border is rounding them up, putting them in camps, and holding them there indefinitely and separating families. Nothing on the left says that that's acceptable. Nothing in American politics should allow that to be acceptable. And so I think the left is quite in the right. And when history books are written, I think we'll be lauded for that.
Let's talk about these crazy left-wing politicians, Hollywood elite from this last week. What do you make of people like Maxine Waters and Curtis Cook calling for open violence against Republicans just because they're winners?
Well, Curtis Cook isn't a Democrat. He's not an elected official, so I thought it was interesting you brought that up. Maxine Waters is an interesting case because she came out and said what all Americans should be saying when there's concentration camps in your country. And what was interesting about that week was within 24 hours, Pelosi and Schumer denounced her, shooting their own congresswoman in the foot, essentially. And it was very interesting to see that happen when they didn't need to. It was clear that if you're going to call for harassing of Trump officials who at that time were supporting policy, you can do that behind closed doors, and to do that publicly and then that starts being thrown at Maxine, it was very interesting. Oh, cool, my roommate's here. What's up, dude? Sorry about that. Sorry, doing this in my living room.
You're like you remember that?
It was a very interesting week, and I definitely Maxine Waters over was any Democrat at the moment because she's saying exactly what needs to be said. You can't have this type of policy being implemented by your federal government and just sit by idly. You can't be a people that allows that to happen. I think most people have, when they were reading their history books in high school and middle school, read about authoritarian regimes and probably asked themselves, what would I do if my country became like that? What would you do? And I think it's quite easy that the easiest, safest tactic is to make sure that those individuals who are enacting that can't get a burrito, can't leave their house without feeling that their policy has ramifications for their own personal safety. You can't allow that. You should not be, to clarify, murdering these officials. You should not be enacting violence, but they should be able to get a job once this is over. They should be allowed to, be out in public and feel safe because their policies are making thousands of people not feel safe as well. And I laud Maxine Waters for her stance.
Last question here on this topic before we move to our second story. We've been getting a lot of tweets, a lot of emails, Facebook messages from a lot of concerned Americans this week on this topic. Do you think it's harder in America 2018 to be successful if you're white?
When you wrote that question, you sent me that question, I just laughed at it because I didn't know. It was just so fucking dumb of a question to ask. Is it harder to make a living being white? No, it's quite easy.
Well, look at affirmative action. White people aren't even allowed to get into Harvard now because of affirmative action.
I'm pretty sure Harvard is 70% white. It's above 70 or 60% white. Most institutions, our university we went to, I think was 60 to 70% white.
Well, of course, it went to a sanctuary city, so whites flourish.
It's very easy to be a white man in this. Very easy to be white in this country.
Don't even get me started on sanctuary cities.
It's almost laughably easy. So.
We need to cool down. We're going to run to our secondary story here. Tempers are flaring on the Beantown Podcast. Our second story, and we'll get you in on this one too, Nick. Democrats calling for completely open borders. Yesterday, butthurt protesters from across the nation rallied in large, libtard sanctuary cities calling for a policy left-wingers have been creaming themselves in their pants about for years. Completely wide open borders, or as so many have been calling them, Obama borders. Apparently, according to Democrats, detaining illegal aliens for attempting to sneak into our country makes us all racist. But where was this outrage when Bush and Obama were in charge? Similarly to what we covered in our last story, liberal outrage over policies that have stood in place for centuries only boils over when they're behind. Sore losers much? You betcha. As illustrated by the continued witch hunt, one which has lasted well over a year now, and the left's continuous incoherent jumble of rage over the same immigration policies enforced by Democrat heroes such as JFK and Obama. The liberals and alt-lefters are beginning to resemble the passenger list on a cruise ship for crazies. See, in this day and age, the left's only identity is to whine and complain about all the winning taking place over in the White House. Instead of substantive and constructive policy debate, they only seem to care about tearing each other down, further dividing our country and waging war brother against brother. Time and time again, crazy left-wingers act as if they're victims of some apocalyptic destruction that, if isn't stopped soon, will mean the end of democracy and liberty, the same values liberals try to destroy on a daily basis. See, sticks and stones and MS-13 and radical Muslims may break our bones, but it's the liberals now who are really trying to hurt us. Finally, to top it all off, the Hollywood liberal elite and politicians like crazy Kirsten Gillibrand are now calling to abolish ICE, the same agency that protects 325 million Americans from gangbangers, aliens, and violent criminals every day, 24/7, 365 days a year. No days off for those guys. And now the cuckoo Dems want to do away with this agency? Destroy it. Get rid of it. They're effectively telling U.S. citizens, hey, you guys, we don't value your lives. We want to kill your babies. And now we want to get rid of people trained and hired to protect you. And with the open borders, they're also now saying, hey, violent criminals. Hey, African warlords. Hey, Central American guerrillas, and not the fun kind. Hey, Eastern European rapists. We want you in our country. We sure hate unborn babies and liberty and freedom, but we would love to have you over here. Does that make sense? It does not make sense to me, frankly. So with that, I want to bring Nick back in, Beantown Political correspondent Nick. Why do you think the loony liberals value the lives of rapists and criminals more than they value the lives of unborn babies?
That was quite a rant. I'm really proud that you were able to write all that in under 24 hours. Like, props to you. You really did read up on your O'Reilly. Yesterday was very interesting in terms of the family separation march, because they were able to do that within a week. I saw numbers in Chicago was the largest, with 60,000 people showing up. Another sign that people are just incredibly fed up.
And I'll add, Chicago, the murder rate is over 92%.
Yeah. And what?
Go ahead.
Luckily, no one was murdered at any of those rallies. Yeah, there was something you brought in your rant about Obama's not having the type of energy against him, and it's true to a point that the left was not as energized against Obama's deportation policies, which were terrible and should be critiqued at every length, as much as we've seen under Trump. And I think there's been kind of a reckoning, especially amongst the Abolish ICE activists and the kind of the movement that's happening on the left right now, where Obama's policies helped lead to ICE being able to separate children at the border and create these camps. He had an opportunity in 8 years to reel back this immigration policy, and instead he ramped it up in an attempt to appease Republicans in the Senate and the House to get an immigration bill, and it got him jack shit. So the kind of conscience of the left at the moment is, if once we're back in power, if we are ever in that position, this agency has to be eradicated, because the only place this agency can go is where it went to last week, where they are implementing a policy of separating children from their mothers at the border and placing them into concentration camps. And I brought this up 10 times. I've used the term concentration camp, because that's what it is. And we have to come to blows with that's the reality. And so it's a movement that is luckily taking off, and I hope that whoever tries to run for the Democratic nominee in 2020 has to go on the national stage and say we're going to abolish ICE, and then within the first 100 days actually do so, because the only place this agency can go is naturally to the right, and we're seeing that today.
Now, if the dummy Democrats, or as I just coined, the Democrats, if they get their way and they have open borders, how long do you think it would be before groups like MS-13 and ISIS completely take over? And do you see this as the fallout from us electing a radical Muslim in 2008?
Jeez. Well, you really went deep in the Breitbart for that one. More people die from heroin overdose than an opioid overdose than violence by MS-13. I personally know 8 people from my high school who have overdosed on opioids, and I don't know a single person who's ever had any issues with MS-13. So it's just kind of another fascist talking point from the right, just to really characterize anyone who crosses the border or anyone who comes to this country who's brown into these kind of very violent groups. And it's quite unfortunate that we're living in a government that is pushing this rhetoric. It's disheartening.
Well, don't get me started on the amount of criminal immigrants who flood into Elburn and distribute their drugs and their kidnappers. And separate topic. We don't have time to really get into that.
Talk about the trauma of that.
Exactly. Let's finish up here with some final thoughts, all about primary season is happening all around us. So this past week, with Rod Blagojevich still behind bars, I will add, the Democrats saw some shocking upsets in election results, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a Venezuelan immigrant with connections to MS-13. Nick, what are some of your thoughts and takeaways from these recent primaries? What does it mean for the midterm elections?
Cortez is probably the first hopeful election we've had. Well, that's not Judge Jones, but she's probably the most hopeful thing we've had this summer. This has just been a brutal summer for Democrats. The upcoming elections, if you are concerned about Republicans running the government and these type of people being in power for the next 4 to 8 years, this is your opportunity to say, this is literally your last chance to make a statement, in my opinion. If we're not able to at least back the House and slow down some of these policies and really obstruct some of the policies they want to implement, it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to gin up enough energy in 2020 and in 2022 to roll back some of these policies. This is the kind of it is like Democrats' last stand. In many ways, the 16 was Republicans' last stand. And it's going to be a really interesting lot of this election. Is more women running for office than at any time in history, and they're winning at incredibly high rates in our district. In the 14th, Lauren Underwood is running, and if she were able to flip that district, it would just be a beautiful day. That's such a gerrymandered district, and where I'm from. I'm personally excited for November 8th because I think we have a best chance. I think we're going to have really high numbers. But someone tweeted this out, and it's been kind of weighing on my mind. They said a government that, once again, creates concentration camps on the border is not a government that's going to engage in free elections. And that's been weighing on my mind. And so the only way we can beat that is everyone's got to get a clipboard, everyone's got to knock on some doors, and we've got to flip some seats. So it's going to be very exciting and terrifying. So we'll see where it goes.
Now, Nick, you live right in Washington. You got your finger on the pulse. What do you feel in terms of a Democratic nominee for president in 2020? Who are you looking at right now?
Oh, it's probably the dumbest thing anyone can tell you is that someone is A, going to win, or B, has the easy shot to win. Because we noticed I very vividly remember in 2015 talking about who was going to win the presidency and how the Dems couldn't possibly lose. And here I am, completely wrong, living in hell world. I'm not going to say anyone because no one has really impressed me too much because it's so early. But I hope it'll be someone who understands that ICE has to be abolished, that people deserve Medicaid for all, that climate change policy, we don't have much time. In fact, we may even be too late in some cases, and that there is a need for antitrust policy in this country more than since the Gilded Age, because our political power, the working class of individuals in lower classes is dwindling, and a real American oligarchy is kind of being created in its place. It's very nerve-wracking, and I think a candidate who's able to vividly spell out those issues will be the one who I'm stunting for and tweeting about religiously. But we'll see. People will start running and things will start getting really heated on November 9th, 2018. So get ready for that.
Very good, very good. Well, I want to thank Beantown Podcast political correspondent Nick Albano for joining us today. Nick, I'll have you stay on the line for 1 second after we go off the air to just wrap it up and get you your speaking engagement payment.
Do I get a medal? You're going to send me a Chipotle gift card? I could really use food. I'm starving.
This coming from the man who pays mere pennies for his Washington, D.C. apartment. Nick, we'll keep you on.
I got lucky.
I just want to say, hey, look at us. Libtards, Democrats, alt-left. I can bring on a crazy left-winger here, and we can have a good political discourse. We can keep it civil. No one's calling for anyone else to be murdered, like Maxine Waters said. So I want to thank Nick, but more so I want to thank myself for putting this show on. This has been Quinn David Furness. This is my podcast. That's it there. I'm going to break character 26 minutes in. Thank you for putting up with that. If you're infuriated, I hope you are infuriated. We wrote this morning. We did not rehearse, and it was a lot of fun. So thank you again for listening. And what I'm going to do is end it right here because we've had some long podcasts happening recently. So thank you for listening. You can email us at beantownpodcast@yahoo.com. You can tweet at us. We're at BeantownCast. I think this was episode 25, maybe, which is a big milestone, so that's exciting. We are halfway through the year here. Next week, we're going to be coming to you live from Chicago. We are doing our 1-year anniversary since moving away from Chicago special, live from Chicago, which I understand might be confusing for a lot of you, so just bear with us. It's going to be fun. It's going to be probably coming from my old apartment up in Rogers Park, which if you ever seen Katrina footage, it's like that, but twice as bad. So anyways,
Jesus, no, it's not. No, it's not.
I'll show you. I'll share some pictures to the Beantown Podcast page after next weekend. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Nick for joining me, and we will catch you next week.